Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Creative Mornings, talk number 112. The month's theme this month happens to be Ember, and there were many different ways we could have connected the theme, but I think today we're talking about risk, resistance, and responsibility. So we felt that the resistance piece that we all have inside us somewhere that hasn't been ignited or may have been ignited or is ready to be ignited today by the talk from our speaker is what the embers of our resistance might be. And that's why today we have with us environmental scientist, environmental chemist, a PhD in environmental chemistry, and who has been associated with the University of Boden since 2004 with different capacities, including the chair of the Department of Chemistry and associate dean for the longest of time. I'm sure she'd be able to tell us more about it. The format today happens to be that we have interspersed our talk, or rather, Dharni has interspersed the talk with a lot of activities which we've already begun for those who've done the post-it note activity. So we want to look at the idea of chemicals and how we think about them and how we may change our perception towards the end of the talk. I'd also like to specially thank Bhargavi Rao, who introduced us to Dharni. And it's been lovely that we've had so many conversations with Dharni to figure out how to best communicate a rather dry subject, which I assure you is anything but dry. So with that, I'm very happy to invite on stage to share with us about chemicals, Dharni Vasudevan.
Thank you all so much for being here and sharing your very precious Sunday morning with me. I'll get us going with this. And some of you participated in this, and we'll refer to this in just a minute. So it's really a gift for me to be able to talk about the broader context that informs my research and my teaching. I started this journey when I was 18 years old. And for reasons only 18-year-olds understand, I decided to leave my very beloved family and friends and head to the United States. There I found environmental engineering science. A very passionate professor brought to me the idea that chemicals have structures, and their structures dictate their personalities, and their personalities in turn dictate their behavior in the environment. And this thread got me hooked. And so I stayed with this thread for a while. And as I stayed with it, and my teaching and my work helped me bring a more interdisciplinary lens to this, I understood the social context of this work that I hope to share with you today. And I want to, before I get started, I want to thank Karishma and Vishwesh for the generosity of their time and wisdom in helping me shape this talk. And I really want to thank Bhargavi Rao. She's with the Environmental Support Group. She's a trustee and senior fellow. She's a tireless environmental advocate and researcher. Bhargavi and I reconnected after several decades. I will let you guess how many decades, at a school reunion. So shout out to, please go to your school reunions when they happen. Your world opens up to new perspectives. So we got to really understand each other's work. Bhargavi connected me to Karishma, which is why I'm here today. And also, my understanding of this has a very US-centric lens, and Bhargavi really helped me understand the Indian context, and particularly the local Bangalore context. So really, thank you for being here today as we get started. So as some of you already realized from the activity we invited you to do, the subject of chemicals in the environment is connected to three words: risk, resistance, and responsibility, as I have crafted this talk. And I'm just going to walk over and see what came up on the board with what you all put in there. So there's a lot of dots or a lot of bindis on the high to the risk. So I invited you to talk about what you feel is your level of risk. So we're seeing a lot of high there. And I asked for one word that requested you to share one word that came up for resistance and responsibility. And with respect to resistance, evolving, vigilant, adapt, antibiotics, resistance, biodegradable, Government rules are some of the words that came up. And with responsibility, I see awareness, ownership, necessary, awareness again, no plastics, discretion, systemic change, responsibility, greed, corporate responsibility. So thank you, and I hope some of the themes of today might resonate with your knowing already. And so the two words or phrases that connect risk, resistance, and responsibilities, as I've thought about it, are knowledge and individual and collective strength. We think about knowledge, we all start with some kind of knowing, and we just started with your innate knowing today with the small exercise. And then we learn, we discover, we reinforce, we might raise questions of knowns and unknowns, and create new knowledge and new knowing. And I hope this will be some of your experience today. I'll invite you to reflect sometimes, talk to someone near you, and please engage the best you can. This will help our collective understanding and knowing of this area. So we'll start with a little bit of a reflection. Take a minute to think about the word chemicals. What comes to mind? You can jot it down or keep it in your mind. And I'll just pause for a few seconds to let you think about what comes to mind when you think of chemicals. Now consider the fact that we all used chemicals. Many of us used chemicals before we got here this morning. And chemicals enhance our quality of life and can be quite life-sustaining in many ways. So what are some examples of chemicals and their life-sustaining qualities? I'll give you a few seconds to ponder that. Now I invite you to talk to someone you may not know and see what came up for you. So give us about a minute. Introduce yourself to someone you may not know and see what came up. So it's really nice to hear you all buzzing, and I want to bring us back. I invite a couple of brave people to share what came up, and Karishma has a mic. So if you put your hand up, she'll bring the mic to you.
So yeah, when we both were discussing the first word, I was thinking about harmful, something which is not natural. And at the same time, he talked about chemical reactions, right? Like I would like you to...
Yes. Okay. So, I thought there are also chemicals that are like neurotransmitters which are in the body or kind of secreted in the body. So, my first word was reaction, but then there are chemicals in the body. So, chemicals can be harmful, chemicals can also be useful. Externally, our perception is that chemicals are unnatural kind of a thing, but there can also be natural, I guess.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah. So, we are juggling both the synthetic nature, the unnatural nature, the harmful nature, the useful nature of chemicals as we think about it. And now, continue the discussion with the person you had and think about an example in these scenarios. And this will really ground where the talk is going. So chemicals are used. We all use chemicals. And then chemicals get out and they move and they may produce problems. So just take a minute, continue your discussion about an example that might come to mind that fits this. Okay, so I'll again bring us back and see if something came up that you'd like to share. Something came up in terms of this example? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an old timer, so maybe I've got something in my mind which most of you may not agree, but I was given to understand Coca-Cola is not a drink. It's more chemical than drinks. Because I was given to understand, I stand corrected, that you don't have to use a detergent. You use Coca-Cola, and that will do the work, you know. And also, I have used Colgate when I get a burn, not burn all, and it works like magic. So I don't know
Thank
what
you.
are we consuming chemicals? Please,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Coca-Cola actually is often used in crime scenes because it's so acidic to clean up the mess. So just putting that out there to continue that thread. Anyone came up with an example of these scenarios that you'd like to share? There's a hand there.
Yeah, we were talking about an hospital setup where chemicals are used as cleaning agents or even to sanitize places, and they get out of the system, at least in a Bangalore setup like Maradi, which picks up the hospital waste and it gets to a disposal ground. But we don't know what happens from there on.
Yes.
Maybe the earth kinds of embodies all of these things, and we don't know thereafter kind of stories. So I'd like to hear more from you on that.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for that example. We'll take one more or two more. Yeah.
Okay, so he was talking about makeup, that all cosmetics that all of us use, and he says it's for the women it's so bad, your skin is taking it. And I pointed out that I wouldn't leave home without my sunblock, which is so important. That's what I think. So we don't know who's right.
Yeah. So really, you're setting up the rest of my talk really well. So thank you. Yeah, it's a complex subject of life sustaining. Yeah. One more, please.
In the same line, personal care products, toothpaste, that was one of the things that was brought up. Triclosan is in our toothpaste, although it is banned in the US and the EU. And triclosan manufacturing facility is in Anekal industrial area. US and EU don't manufacture that chemical as well. It is also in our microbial hand wash that we were supposed to use so much during the COVID, and it has polluted our waterways. Even the Kaveri River, which is a lifeline, they found huge amounts of triclosan and other associated compounds in it, which is a huge risk when they move out into the waterways and get into our bodies.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So great examples. You might think I planted these people, as you'll see. So if you think about what you raised with your collective knowledge and your knowing already, is that we are balancing the life endangering and life sustaining. So sunblock, for example, that was a good perspective on what do we worry about. And we use chemicals. So pharmaceuticals came up. Another thing is waterproofing, what we use for waterproofing. So we use chemicals, they're important, they're life sustaining, and they get out and move. So we don't have that much control on them getting out and moving. So if we think about a few examples of chemicals getting out and moving, here's a newspaper headline on Mavallipura water unfit for drinking. So Bangalore solid waste used to be transported to a landfill in Mavallipura, and the leaching from our solid waste really impacted the water quality of the people who lived in Mavallipura. Another example is a thermometer factory in Kodaikanal. First was worker exposure to mercury, which causes harm, and also ecosystem exposure because of disposal. So chemicals get out and move. Sometimes we anticipate it and it could be known, and sometimes we don't. A very long range transport is PFAS, which is a material we use for Teflon, is found in polar bears up in the poles. So chemicals can move pretty long distances. So, we use them, they're very useful, but they get out. Now, if we think about this idea of them causing harm or problems. And this is why we worry about risk and why many of you might have put the bindi on the high risk category, right? We're worried about the problems that chemicals can cause, even while we're holding this duality of life sustaining and life endangering aspects of chemicals. So some other examples are, antibiotics are used a lot, particularly in animal feed, proactively, create a lot of antibiotic resistance. We also have, here's an example of the sex ratios and intersex characteristics in fish upstream and downstream of a pharmaceutical plant in France. And you can see the gray bar, the increase in fish showing both sexes, characteristics of both sexes. And here's another one of male fish producing eggs. And so we see wildlife impacts pretty substantively, and it's easy to measure as we think about chemical fate in the environment. And at the same time, we rely on antibiotics, and many of us have gone through ways in which we are alive because we were able to have access to these kinds of chemicals. So this is a very complicated topic we are sitting with here. The other thread I wanted to point out is to individual and collective strength. And I will keep coming back to these voices who, at enormous cost, people who have the most to lose and the least to spare, speaking up and visibilizing harm, and in this case, visibilizing harm to chemicals. Now, this is very similar to all kinds of social justice issues, and these are the voices that become powerful. So I'm going to show you a short clip.
The worst affected are typically the Dalits and the extremely poor communities. Meticulously documented the water condition there, the pollution levels, the health impacts, and this report created quite a bit of stir.
It has 20 years of research.
And as a result, the court said, city of Bangalore needs to imagine a future without landfills.
The fact that two people stood up and said no to the city's waste landing up in their village, that story needs to be told.
So this is a clip from Waste and the City that Teapoy Films actually produced, and Bhargavi and Rao and Leo Saldana were very instrumental in the creation of this film. And I really invite you to watch it. It's less than 30 minutes long. It's available freely. And it really characterizes the idea around waste in Bangalore. What happens to our waste? And what is the impact of our waste? And I'll come back to Ramesh and Srinivas, to the two brave people who spoke up and then found allies to move this movement forward. And so we'll keep being reminded of this resistance that visibilizes harm at enormous personal cost. So I'm going to take a pulse. I'm going to name 5 things and just raise your hands if any point you're worried about if this is safe. So the first is water from your tap. Okay, lots of hands. Vegetables in the market, also a lot of hands. The air you breathe as you go for a walk or at school, hands are staying up. Plastic container that stores your food, more hands. The soil your children might play in, or children you know might play in. Okay, so there's a lot of, the pulse is telling us something about risk. So there's an intuitive knowing we all have. No one really gave you a chemical formula for risk, but it's your lived experience of wanting chemical safety, and there's an intuitive understanding and knowing we have about risk. If we think about risk, there are 3 key themes that keep coming back, and I'll take some time on each of these themes. So we worry about risk because of hazard or harm, because chemicals can cause problems, and this is as we thought about it. So the harm is an important piece of this. And so if we're using chemicals without harm, there's no risk, right? The next is exposure. We being exposed to the chemicals because they get out and move. They don't just stay where we intended them to be. So the characteristic is getting out and moving. And how do we limit that? That becomes another way to think about risk. And in the last few years, vulnerability has been finally brought into this equation of risk assessment, is not all people react to harm easily. And we think about that in terms of, air quality of elderly and children when it's a bad quality day. So different people react to harm differently. And similarly, by social structure, people might be reacting to harm differently, and we'll come back to that. So these are three key ideas that will keep coming back. And so here's some, there's a reason your hands went up. There was lead in vegetables in Bangalore, right? And so this is unanticipated and worrisome. When we think about the thermometer factory in Kodaikanal, we might say, could this risk have been prevented? Could the exposure have been prevented because we know mercury has harm? And then the question with Mavallipura becomes harder to deal with. Are we really thinking about the impact of what we are doing and the social hierarchy that decides that our waste can go to Mavallipura and risk another community there, right? And so, and those are some uncomfortable things we have to sit with while recognizing we can't live our lives without chemicals. And so if we think about this idea of exposure here, you all intuitively know through this exercise that we are exposed by anything we ingest, anything we inhale or breathe, or products that we touch or consume. And essentially, the exposure can happen from air, water, soils, products, and food. So there is this baseline level exposure from the general population, but then there are populations who are close to polluting factories who have additional exposures. There are workers who have occupational hazards and legacy exposures, people close to incineration site or something like that. So built upon a baseline level of exposure, certain communities have additional exposure. And the dots signifying we can be exposed to multiple chemicals at a time. And so that's the idea around exposure that we can think about, because chemicals get out and move, there's a potential for exposure, and can we stop that? And that's the conversation we can have. So if we think about chemicals getting out and moving, so how does it go from the source of release to us or ecosystems and exposure? And that whole field is called chemical fate. That's the area I spend a lot of my time thinking about. And to understand chemical fate, it's easy to think about three processes that inform chemical fate. Why do chemicals get out and move? I like to call them the three T's: transport, transfer, and transformation of chemicals. So if we think about that, I am showing you the mercury cycle here, and I'll refer to that from time to time. So transport, think of a chemical on a bus. So it's just moving. It's moving with the air. It's moving wherever it got emitted. So say mercury came out of the smokestack of a coal-fired power plant, that mercury can move from city A to city B, right? So it's moving in the air. Likewise, if something's discharged in the water, it moves with the water downstream. So we think of that as transport. Other examples are, there was the aerial spraying of endosulfan in Kasaragod in Kerala on cashew plantations, and the aerial spraying resulted in endosulfan moving and really negatively impacting communities. And so again, it's moving there with the air. And also, chemicals don't respect international borders. The fingerprint of soot from China has been found in the United States, right? And so this is the kind of movement that's capable in the air. Now, then the next process is transfer. So think of a chemical hopping off the bus and getting into a taxi cab. Or if you think about mercury, mercury can go from the air into the water. And we can also think about different ways in which a chemical is transferring compartments. So you can go from the water or the soil into vegetables. The mercury can go from the water into the fish, from the fish to the human population. So you're changing the matrix that the chemical is in. And we live in such an interconnected world. DDT, which was used to control malaria even recently in the tropics, can grasshopper its way up to the poles, and it's found in the breast milk of Inuit populations. And so you can really, again, think of transferring compartments and mercury moving. And the last is transformation. The chemical breaks down. It becomes something else. It can become more benign or it can become more toxic. So in the case of mercury, bacteria can change mercury into a form of mercury called methyl mercury, which is toxic, which then goes into fish and can go into humans that consume the fish. Chromium-3 is used in tanneries. So in the Palar River Basin in Kerala, there are a lot of tanneries. And the tanneries discharge chromium in a form called chromium-3. It's not very toxic. And that chromium is even an essential nutrient in small quantities. However, something like air, can think about your apples when you cut them browning. The process is oxidation. So a process like that can change chromium-3 to chromium-6, which is very toxic. So this is where agents within the atmosphere can transform chemicals. And so in a way, once the chemical gets out, it's subjected to all of these processes which determines where it goes in the environment. So how do we decide which chemical undergoes which of these processes? So I'm going to digress here and have you do a reflection and just indulge me. So think about yourself watching a lovely sunset. What are you, with your friends, what are you feeling? What are you doing? Now think about yourself being stuck in traffic while taking a family member to a doctor's appointment. What are you feeling? What might you be doing? I'll just take one shout out. Anyone want to share? Yeah. So, yeah, stressful. So think about what you feel as internal energy and think about what you do as behavior, and your surroundings and your personality impact how you feel, right? So you might be the person that likes to sit calmly and watch a sunset and feel calm. You might be the person who likes to jog and watch the sunset. And so your personality plays a role there. And then you might be that person who is always calm, stuck in traffic, and really zen, saying, we'll get there, no worries. Or you might be the one screaming, yelling at the people around you, right? So your surroundings and your personality have an influence there. So what got me really excited about chemicals is sometimes I feel chemicals are a lot like us. Some days I think they're simpler than us. Some days I think they're more complicated than us. And so if we think about then which chemicals undergo these three different processes and what combination, we can think about chemical structure, okay? And I saw very few scientists' hands go up. This only time, next two slides, you'll see one chemical structure, and then it'll be easy going after that. So chemical structures are really a beautiful window into their personality. And their personality helps us understand their behavior, their fate in the environment, and how we might be exposed to them. So here's an example of ciprofloxacin and DDT, an old legacy pesticide. So when we think about structure, we think about what elements the chemical is made up of. So you see oxygen, nitrogen, fluorides here. Anytime two dashes meet, there's a carbon there. And here you just see a lot of chlorines. And ciprofloxacin also carries positive and negative charge. So all of this structure influences his personality. Ciprofloxacin likes being in the water. DDT wants to get the heck out of water and onto soils and into fish. And so this is dictated by its structure and its personality. And its affinity, as I talked about, their affinity to different matrices. So this pushes their transfer into a system. And how they behave in a system depends on whether they're in water or not. So the surroundings also impact it. And so essentially, we can predict very easily, and sometimes not so easily, we can anticipate where chemicals might go. We can anticipate exposure to some extent. So here's just some data for us to think about. Red and blue are PCBs. You see their concentration in breast milk in Sweden going down. And we stopped using these chemicals, and there was a follow-through in the decrease in concentrations. And then we saw PBDEs. These are used in flame retardants. and we were fireproofing a lot of material that we use. Again, life-sustaining, important to have fire prevention control. We saw an increase at the same time in breast milk in Sweden. So what we're seeing here is that we can look at the structure and say, they're kind of similar. There's bromine instead of chlorine, and maybe some difference here. Might we have not anticipated that PBDEs would get into breast milk? So these are the tough conversations that are not necessarily had when we're manufacturing new chemicals. And so this is where, again, we come back to resistance and responsibility. Who gets to visualize the harm and who has the responsibility to think about harm? So to summarize exposure, in exposure assessment, to anticipate this, we have to know where the pollution is coming from, where the people are located, what are the routes and the amounts and the time that they're exposed to these chemicals, and we put that all together. And chemical structure and our understanding of the movement of air and water, hydrology, meteorology, all of this is hugely helpful in coming up with exposure assessments. So we can anticipate or predict chemical fate to know what the risk might be, but sometimes we want proof. And so we have to monitor or actually measure the chemical in air, water, soil, in fish, in breast milk. And we might have seen some crime shows where they put a matrix into a machine and it tells you everything that's there. That's actually not possible. It's really, really hard to do. You have to have an idea what you're looking for, how to process the matrix, and it's really expensive to do. So these pushes us to complicated questions around proving where the chemical might go or anticipating it with monitoring. And monitoring is really, really important. So if you think about air quality index in Bangalore, that's based on monitoring certain pollutants in the air. And so essentially, if we are not thinking about prediction and anticipating it, and if we're not monitoring, the sad part is we recognize exposure only when we hear about harm. And it's hear about harm to certain communities. So here's a video that I like to play.
Say, what about the polluting, the mercury poisoning? It's life-threatening. There's kids suffering. Poison in the soil. You don't have a spoil. Your cleanup was a sham. There's poison in the air. You ain't done. Kodaikanal won't. Kodaikanal won't. Kodaikanal won't step down till you make amends.
So that was Sophia Ashraf, really brave young woman who's a rapper who sort of really brought to light what was happening in Kodaikanal. So if we think about this idea of harm only being visibilized because of brave voices, it's humbling to think about that we wait for this. So we'll think about harm next. So, we talked about chemicals causing harm, and, just a reminder of what were the ways the chemicals you selected caused harms to human or ecosystems, right? People talked about what's the impact of triclosan, or what's the impact of makeup or sunblock, other things we're using. And so as you sit with this, can you think about all the ways in which, as I'm talking about, chemicals might cause harm to humans and ecosystems? So just take 30 seconds to ponder that. Yeah. Any ideas? Yeah?
I'm sorry to say, but our government is so complacent. People are eating, that pan parag and gutka and all that. What is that government doing about it? They're allowing it. Like in the States, the gun lobby is so strong. Maybe the tobacco lobby is so strong that the government has no spine. They're like a toothless tiger. I'm sorry to say that.
Yeah, we'll talk about responsibility in a little bit, and I was just would love to hear about harm. Ocean acidification, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So we worry. Yeah, thank you. So does exposure cause cancer? Does it cause endocrine disruption? Yes.
Yes, that, and I think the most significant one for me is that some of these chemicals pass from mother to the baby via
Yes.
it's able to penetrate the placenta. So we are having our offsprings born pre-polluted where they didn't have any role to play. And then once they're born via the breast milk, the chemicals are then again that sanctity, that intimacy one has with their child, that is, makes the novel entity pollution that we are looking at very personal. And also we have to question intergenerational equity. The baby doesn't know what it's born into. So I think that's most significant.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that very sobering possibility of harm and harm, as you say, that's documented, and hopefully we'll see a few examples of that. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on possible harm. And I'm going to ask you to think about something that seems simple but may not be. I'm going to do two options. Option one, and the question is around who should prove what. Before a company or municipality releases a chemical or waste into your environment, the company or municipality must prove it's safe. That's option A. Option B is after a company or municipality has released a chemical or waste into the environment and you have become sick, you must prove the chemical caused your illness. So I'm going to request a show of hands for option A. Okay, that's a good amount of hands. Option B. Yeah, okay. So just stay with that. There was a lot of instinctually, a lot of people wanted option A, and then there was option B. So we'll stay with that discomfort around and tension around that as we think about harm. So if you think about harm, in harm assessment, you're thinking about linking a substance to a particular health effect or a disease, right? So we're talking about these kinds of problems that chemicals are causing, and this is just a reminder of risk. And now that we're moving to the hazard part of the risk. The issue I had you reflect is who carries the burden of proof, right? So we will stick with burden and proof. Both of it becomes important to think about here. So as far as I understand, in the US and in India, the burden of proof is on the poisoned and not the poisoner. And the idea of proof itself is complicated. Proving that a particular harm is linked to a particular health effect, right? And we'll return to this. And this is, again, the resistance and responsibility piece coming back. Oftentimes, we wake up to the harm when a mother says, no, there's too many kids who are sick on my street. When a farmer says, no, my cattle are dying and staggering. When the air smells, when the water just looks wrong, right? And so people are standing up and saying, this is not right. This is embodied knowledge of harm that often comes before data. So in Kasaragod, the mothers of children suffering from cerebral palsy had already kind of geographically mapped the aerial spraying to the disease occurrence without having sort of scientific training. So this is the intuitive knowledge that gets us making this link and thinking about harm. So I'll just talk a little bit. You all raised some important factors around harm, and I'll summarize some of that really quickly here. When we think of harm to unintended targets by chemicals, it can go anywhere from protective enzymes being destroyed, energy processes being blocked, functioning of organs being impacted, malignancy of cells, which came up, changes in reproductive behavior and success and susceptibility, and in extreme cases, death. Now, if we think about how do we assess harm, there's a whole field of toxicology, which is looking at the adverse effect of a chemical on a specific organ. Now, there's all kinds of toxicity one has to study. Genotoxicity, neurotoxicity relates to behavior, reproductive effects, which was brought up in our discussion, immunotoxicity, dermal toxicity. And most of this work is done on animal models and bioassays. this is very complicated. There's so many endpoints for toxicity. Do we measure toxicity of all chemicals for all endpoints? Who pays for the testing? This is really expensive to do and at huge cost. So we'll sit with this idea around that. The next is endocrine disruption, which was brought up. In 1996, Theo Goldburn found that at low levels, very low levels, where you don't even see a toxic effect, you might see an endocrine disruption effect. So what is that? So our endocrine system is basically a series of messengers, hormones that go through our body, signaling to our body growth, appetite. In the womb, it could be sexual differentiation. So these are the messages that are coming from hormones in our body through our endocrine system. What Theo Goldburn found is that at these very low levels, we were seeing chemicals mimic estrogen and having certain kinds of effects that estrogen might have. And so here's just a cartoon. In the normal functioning, a hormone meets a receptor and it tells our body, it's time for puberty, or in the womb, it's time for a certain kind of development. When there's endocrine disruption, in the red is the chemical that can take the place of the receptor and increase the response, or it can block the receptor and decrease the response. So in the wild, and in labs, people have noted feminization of fish, masculinization of fish, hermaphrodism in frogs, imposex in snails. This has been documented in the wild, okay, with endocrine disruption. As we think about harm and the burden of proof, think back to the chemicals causing problems. Now consider, how will you prove that harm was caused by a chemical? So I'll just pause for a little bit. How will you prove harm? And now play devil's advocate. How will you create doubt? Okay, so thank you. The comment we had is correlation is not causality, and we'll come back to that. Just because you see something is correlated is not causal from statistics, right? So, ask big tobacco how to create doubt. Yeah. Anything else coming up? Right? So, we've made a decision to not ethically test humans for chemicals, and that is a good thing, right? That is why proof becomes really difficult. We have animal models, we have cell line models. So toxicology is based on animal models and cell lines. Endocrine disruption has been shown and proved in the wild. How do you extrapolate and say, if this happens in the wild, it will happen in humans? That is where doubt can come in. And that's why the burden of proof is very burdensome there, right? So then how do we handle human effects? There is the field of epidemiology. So this is studying in humans unintended past experiments. And so what epidemiologists do, particularly those dealing with chemicals, is look at disease occurrence in human populations, look at all the causal factors, and decide what's going on. So they study a population that you see the effect with, a population you don't see the effect with, think about all the factors, and do all kinds of important statistics there. So 2 examples I'll give you, which is very related to some points that came up in the discussion earlier. Diethylstilbestrol was given to women to prevent miscarriages, but we saw an effect in their adult daughters developing vaginal cancer. Similarly, thalidomide was given to prevent nausea in pregnant women, and again, the deformities were in the children who were born. And so you see this generational effect that, thank you for pointing out earlier, was documented a while ago. And so this is an example of epidemiology where it's easy to study. In a sense, you have prescriptions, you know who took the medicine. And so this kind of epidemiology is doable. Now think about chemicals getting out and moving, and think about epidemiology there, which is much harder. I had another implant in the audience. Correlation is not causation, right? So essentially, all epidemiologists can do is provide strong statistical correlation, but is that proof? What is the level of proof that we want? And so this, again, has a lot of uncertainty, just like toxicology and endocrine disruption work, where we're extrapolating from animals to humans or cell lines to humans. So this really complicates this idea of proving harm and makes us think about philosophically, how do we make decisions in the face of a lot of uncertainty? So when the battleground is proof and what counts as evidence and what counts as valid knowledge, what we have is the fundamental act of insisting that what our body counts is knowledge. And that's the resistance piece that's coming in, particularly because the proof that we demand is so hard. And another comment I wanted to make on epidemiology is this great book by Dan Fagan called Tom's River, where he showed that it is agonizingly difficult to have strong statistical correlation in epidemiological studies to prove harm. One, communities may be small and our statistical benchmark is very high. Two, the effect is in the next generation, so there's a huge latency period. People move, so it's hard to track all these causal factors, right? So this harm piece becomes difficult here. So resistance is insisting what our bodies counts as knowledge. So what I'm going to show you is a clip from with Rashida B speaking and Champa Devi Shukla is by her side. These are the tireless advocates from the Bhopal disaster of methyl isocyanide who have continued to fight for their communities. And this is her talking at the Environment Peace Prize.
सत्ता और पूंजी के आसन पर चढ़ाए जाने वाले फूल नहीं हैं। हम भोपाल की नारी हैं, फूल नहीं चिंगारी हैं। हम अंधेरा जीतने वाली चिंगारी हैं। इस जमीन पर और कुदरत की चीजों को बर्बाद करने वालों को हम ललकारते हैं और हमारे संघर्ष के जरिए महज हम पीड़ित बनकर जीना नहीं चाहते हैं। हम जीते हैं और जीतेंगे। इनकलाब जिंदाबाद। थैंक यू।
So why do we need resistance? Right? Why do we need these voices as we sit with these hard ideas around burden of proof? As I understand it, we, at least in the US and in India, we live in an inverted system of responsibility. The community must prove harm. The manufacturer does not have to necessarily prove safety. The chemicals are innocent until they're proven guilty, even if that work to prove guilty takes a lot of time and resources that the communities don't have and have the very data that the manufacturers own. And harm is usually not a surprise. In many cases, it was concealed. And the first line we know from workers and the harm that the occupational harm that they're facing. And the right to manufacture and dispose is presumed, but the right not to be exposed has to be earned. This is kind of really chilling to sit with. And so the only option is brave, courageous resistance. And this is where I have us hold resistance and responsibility as we move forward. So what's the typical arc of resistance? The community harm is embodied, and I mentioned this many times. And in the US, the pattern is the resistance grows. Particularly, people get charged up when they know that there was evidence of harm that was conceived and their suffering was deemed okay. And then they move from the community to the courtrooms, important allies helping out, lawyers, doctors, working pro bono, journalists trying to expose things. In India, we have very strong people's movements, like we saw in Bhopal, in Jharkhand, the Mavallipura movement with two people standing up. Really, there are as many examples as you like to see how people's movement, people who have the least to spare and the most to lose, choosing to visualize harm and say we will not be erased and our suffering matters. And there's the support of outside allies. So Environmental Support Group for the Mavallipura case, Center for the Science and the Environment, so many amazing NGOs there. Also, in India, we have a substantial legal infrastructure that can help. So we can think about public interest litigation, which has been used a lot, the Water Act, the Environment Act, the Air Act, there's the National Green Tribunal, there's Article 21, the right to life, which can encompass the right to a clean environment. So there's all of that there. And at every stage, we're contesting what is knowledge and what level of proof do we need for the poisoning to stop, and at what cost, economic, psychological, health cost to these communities. So why might we have this? And this is, for me, a particular playbook, and I've seen it more in the United States, so I'll ascribe it to that. Many, many examples of this is the industry denies knowledge of harm. It's concealed. They know it's there, but they don't have to produce it. They manufacture doubt. Ask the tobacco industry, it goes back to there. They don't have to even create new data to their liking. All they have to do is expose uncertainty. And as I talked about, there's uncertainty because we can't test humans. There's uncertainty because we're extrapolating. There's uncertainty because our statistical correlations cannot have a 95% significance, right? So there is a way in which, while decisions have to be made with uncertainty in mind, we have to think about what's happening with doubt being raised there. And also accountability can be diffused because of confidential business information or national security. Companies can also export a hazard from an area with strict environmental jurisdictions to areas without strict jurisdictions. And small business versus collective. So one small business may not be doing a lot, but if there are like 600 tanneries in one place, the collective impact might be high. And you might ask, where does the government come in? And it's in a very tricky situation here. We have, in some ways, it is the protector of harm, but it is also the promoter of industrialization and development. And sometimes it does own the factories that produce harm, particularly in the energy sector. And so it's a very complicated place we're in with that. And that delineation of protecting harm and harming is hard to navigate. And while we have a really strong legal infrastructure, the enforcement piece is difficult, right? Yeah. So, you know, we're closing in and we're finishing up in the next few slides here. So what has happened because of this inverted system of responsibility, these kinds of things that we've talked about, is that there's quite a knowledge, there's a lot we know, and there is a big knowledge gap because there's a lack of incentives to produce this knowledge. So this slide is from the EU, and it's an example of if there are about 100,000 chemicals on the market, we have poor characterization of hazard and exposure data for about 70,000 chemicals. So what we know is really just good characterization is the tip of the iceberg. And another statistics I read is that only 1% of the chemicals out there have any kind of international sort of accepted legislation, right? So our ability to anticipate and harm and hazard is limited. But I'll argue that we know a lot, that we can move forward with if we have the conviction to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. And so as we move with that, and I'll skip over this reflection and I had you think about harm affecting people differently. And that's the idea of the vulnerability piece there. Vulnerability is the ability of different people to either avoid, withstand, or navigate harm, right? So some of it is intrinsic, your life stage, elderly versus children. If you're a pregnant mother, you have different levels of vulnerability to chemicals. Some can be extrinsic, so non-chemical factors like access to health, poverty, racism, classism, or acquired. You might have a pre-existing condition like diabetes, or you might be downstream of an incineration plant, so you're acquiring more vulnerability. And finally, inherited. There are members of our community who inherit exposure by social hierarchy. So these are the Dalits, these are our Purma Karmikas, who are our waste collectors, who we have allocated by social hierarchy inherited exposure to chemicals, right? And so when we're thinking about risk, we need to think about the most vulnerable in coming up with endpoints, and that kind of design benefits all of us. So I will summarize by saying we have the potential, we know a lot. I've talked a lot about how things are complicated and expensive and hard to do, and we know a lot. I want to offer. If we think about exposure, hazard, and vulnerability, there are ways we can limit exposure. There's treatment at manufacturing facilities. There's ways in which we can think of worker exposure being limited. Hazard can be prevented. There's a whole field of green chemistry trying to not worry after the pipeline, but trying to produce chemicals that are not toxic in the first place. And movements are really thinking about keeping vulnerability in mind. So what we have before us is the ability to, it's a simple cartoon here, but if we can limit any one of this, right? If we have an umbrella, we're not going to have the sun burning us, right? We wear sunblock, we're not going to have the sun burning us, right? So there's a way in which we can limit exposure, and we can keep trying to anticipate and limit exposure and limit harm, right? And really keep in mind the vulnerability of people. So I'd like to end with this ideas of embers, which was the theme for this month's talk. Embers represent the quiet, enduring remnants of fire, what remains after a blaze. They are warmth, resilience, and transformation. For me, this really resonates with the story of chemicals. And even as I hold that these stories are stories of incredible pain, come at an incredible cost to many lives, it's also a story of hope for me. And honestly, when I used to teach earlier, I used to fake this hope because I couldn't leave 18-year-olds leaving a classroom feeling hopeless. But I today, at my age, having done this for over 30 years, it is truly hope, because I can sit with the discomfort and the pain and accept that this is where we are. And for me, it's a story of hope, because knowledge cannot be permanently suppressed. It can be denied, it can be delayed, but it can't be destroyed. Communities have produced real, measurable victories at huge, enormous cost, which keeps us moving forward. The support of allies and advocates is just huge, right? We have many advocates sitting in this room. And tirelessly, NGOs are working to support communities from the back, helping them move forward. You have young, brave artists like Sophia Ashraf, most recently at the Kochi Biennale. A photographer had images of children affected by endosulfan in Kasargod. So there are people keeping us reminded and advocating and helping us remember. And finally, a new generation, many of you in this room are producing many new infrastructures for knowing. New water testing, digital organizing, global solidarity, and the list goes on. And so really it is a story of hope as we think about a story of pain alongside it. So this is the last slide and the last reflection, and I invite you to carry an ember of hope with you. Dial down the practicality, forget the constraints of today, and if you envision a world with limited chemical risk, what is one primary design principle for safety you'd like to advocate? So just sit with that for a second, and we're going to pass out the Post-it notes. And I'll just pause for a minute, and then we'll have you capture the one word that comes to mind on a Post-it. So I'm realizing not everyone has pens with them right now. So if you've been talking to someone, just share the one word that came up for you as we think about this. And I would very much like if people can just share out whether you heard from your neighbor or your own word that came up as you think about this design principle. So
Circularity.
circularity, thank you. Yeah. 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 Yes. So this whole idea of the precautionary principle, how do we make decisions with uncertainty in mind and safety and guardrails as primary, right? I saw another, yeah?
May not be a design principle, but my word that came to my mind was conscientiousness.
Conscientiousness, wonderful. Yeah, any other words? It doesn't have to be a design principle. Yeah, please share. Sorry, Sid. Minimalism? Yeah, yeah. Ethics? Yes, ethics. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, speak up as individuals. Wonderful, wonderful. Anything else? Yes, please. Harmless? Ha- yeah? Yeah. Yes, yes. How do we think about it being harmless? Yeah. We'll take a couple before we close out. Yeah? Visibility, wonderful.
To even have the first point of correlation. That could help.
Wonderful. Like speak up and really reflection and self accountability and responsibility that way. I heard another voice, yeah? Yes, choosing really wisely. Now, I'll do another shout out to the Mavallipura documentary and really thinking about in this time of fast food when you know, when we can make knee-jerk quick reactions. Yeah, buy less. Yeah. Consume less. Excellent. Yeah, yeah. So if you think about what is the principle, commerce versus health. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so ecosystem coexistence with the ecosystem there. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Economic growth, because a lot of the societies that are impacted are the economically marginal societies, because they are the ones receiving our waste being dumped. So economic growth can actually help them
Yeah, yeah.
have that right of person.
Yes, economic growth.
I would say innovation, because I think quantum computers are going to fundamentally change chemistry. Because if you want to develop a new solvent for a harmful chemical right now, it's hard to find the configuration for that. But quantum computers could find that for you in 2 seconds. So it's innovation.
Yeah, yeah. So it comes back to that, you know, hope coming from new knowledge and innovation. So we think about things at the start of the pipeline instead of at the end. Yeah, I'll take one more. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, recycle and reuse and using the bio concept of things. I'll take one last comment, and I know they would like us to go to questions, or maybe we'll take two more and then we'll go to questions. Yeah.
I don't know whether this is completely out of context, but all soaps have chemicals, right? So I would like to give an example of my wife. Been married for the last 55 years. She has never used a soap on her face, and her skin still glows. Thank you.
Yeah. I want to give a shout out to actually one of the Creative Morning talks that I watched on this subject as I got prepared. Karishma, I'm blanking on the name, Ravi Shankar, but yeah, gave a talk on exactly like soaps and using, what really struck me is we think lather is clean, but actually you don't need lather for a cleansing agent. And so if you're interested in this topic, please go to the Creative Mornings website and you'll learn more about that. I had one comment back there. Yeah. So really, a radical shift in thinking, which comes back to the ideas around self-reflection and thinking about what do we prioritize over what, and thinking about, yes, at the corporate level. Yeah, absolutely. One more hand up, yeah? Yes. Embrace discomfort and inconvenience, right? So it's actually when you sit with something that's uncomfortable just for a little while longer, a lot of wisdom emerges. And so that's a great point to stop with that note. And I think we're open to questions, right? I'll let Karishma do that with the time piece.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, so we can start taking questions. Please put your hands up so we can come to you because we'd like to record your question.
Yeah. And I'll, before I take the first question, if you've written something on a Post-it, could you hand it to one of the volunteers and they'll put it up on the screen. And if you haven't, that's okay, but just an invitation to pass your Post-it. Yeah, go ahead.
So it is also related to the word that I wanted to say. This word is solar punk. Solar punk. Okay, so we have this cultural idea of cyberpunk. It's a dystopian society where technology takes over and it's all doom basically. Solar punk is an opposite idea where nature and technology coexist. They exist in harmony, and basically you can visualize it like a self-sustaining community using technology extensively but also having the control in their hands, like we were talking about. So yeah, so recently I have been keeping a tab on solarpunk for 4 years now, like as like my own cultural know abouts and all. But recently it's been taking off really well, like in last week only. A lot of my personal algorithm is set in a way like I'm getting constant feed from all around the world, giving people are talking about this. Like recently it's starting to blow up. So that is something that we really need a very cultural, like a very radical cultural shift in order to take control, make things bottoms up, and own self-sustaining communities basically. So what would
Yeah. No, I have Mike, so
sorry.
thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to go and study social punk now. I'm a solar punk, sorry. I am a totally different generation, so this is very educational for me, and I will definitely dive into it. I really think we need these kinds of different modes of thinking because there are certain things that are so fixed that if we try to change what exists may be a harder road than to create a new, as you're saying, right? Can you create, and it all is to sort of, for a scientist, this might be woohoo, but like manifesting really these kinds of brave, kind of innovative thinking of the co-living of, technology and sustainability. So thank you so much for raising that. I think it's a beautiful idea. Other questions coming up? Yeah, there's a couple back there. Can we take those first, the people who haven't got a chance to ask?
I don't know if you've studied this, but I'm curious about the Delhi case where you have all the power centers there, and so they directly suffer from all the chemical pollution there, but still not much can be done, right? I understand there are factors to do with nature, like there's apparently a drift from the neighboring states and all that. But then I'm curious, even when there's complete incentive for the act, because the people with the power, their families stay there as well, right? So they have direct incentive to fix that. It still seems quite unfixable. So have you studied Delhi a bit, and what do you think about that?
So I have not studied Delhi. My knowledge is very U.S. centric. And I'm going to ping someone in the audience in just a second. I know about LA a little bit, so it's kind of in the valley. So in a way, you have by geographical design all of it coming in there. and at certain times of the commute. And some of it is just when the sun goes up and comes down and what causes smog and what are the reactions taking place. I think in the US at least, it was like stringent vehicular emission standards that were the case, and certain factory standards. And I have to just be honest, and I don't know much about Delhi, and I'm going to invite Bhargavi to see if she can, add some insight there. Yeah, so Bhargavi says she hasn't studied Delhi either. I think, there's a lot of competing forces there, right? If you think about any kind of change in policy or structure, there's a lot of inertia to change. And so it's the resistance, the speaking up that's needed. And yeah, it's got to be more than Delhi, because Delhi alone, it's global and it's also nationwide. Yeah. There was another question back there. Yeah.
So India and of course the world is moving towards nuclear power. And recently in December, we passed the Shanti Bill, which makes small module reactors very common across India. And there are several sites that's been looked at right now in Karnataka for these small module reactors, and nuclear industry is privatized. And when we look at chemicals, I think the most dangerous one that we associate with is these radioactive chemicals. And now it's coming in our doorstep. It could be set up in an industrial area. It could be set up just inside the urban centers. It is going to be set up in the very eco-sensitive Western Ghats. So I was just wondering, when we talk about chemicals, this does not usually factor in. And what do you think of it? What are your thoughts, even in terms of long-range transport?
Yeah.
And there are also not many studies in India. And here in Karnataka, we have it in Kaiga nuclear power plant, which is very close by. And down there, the fish is contaminated, but we really don't have any studies to sort of go by.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts, basically?
Yeah, so some of it is the processing, right? So another people's movement was, I think, in Jharkhand around the uranium processing and the impact of those wastes. So, if you take the arc of the start to the finish, there is the piece around the processing and what happens with the air, the water in the processing piece and the impact. There's also after the fact, what do we do with the waste and keep the waste safely? This talks about multi-generationally what's going to happen with that waste, right? So there's a lot of complicated things to handle. And, there's technology that exists for prevention, for harm, for safety to be considered in the decision making. I have to be honest to say I really struggle if I hold climate change in perspective and the options, and the reality is that people are not moving right now to consuming less. And so on the one hand, nuclear is an option in reducing greenhouse emissions, but can we do it safely, right? Like right with anything else, if we're thinking about batteries for solar power or any kind of technology, for me, it's not an easy answer. It's very complicated, and how it all comes back to, can we anticipate the possible harm in really, really thoughtful, careful ways? Going back to the precautionary principle, can we really use the precautionary principle in the design and the function in the aftermath of that? That's just something that's coming up.
I think we have time for one more question.
Can you give us a US-centric example where you, I don't know whether you had some experience in battling all these forces, and as a scientist, carrying it through, whether you are successful or not, we don't know, but at least some snapshot of the journey in this area.
So I work in a lab. So I have not been an environmental advocate in the US. My work is what comes out in journals of what we produce or things like that. It's in my teaching that I talk about more of the most social context of what we do. There are, I was going to say 1 million, but it's probably not 1 million, but hundreds of books and articles on this story of people's voices and resistance. Most recently with perfluoroalkylated substances, the PFAS issue, there was so much denial. There was also a lot unknown because these chemicals behaved in ways environmental chemists and engineers didn't quite understand. And, really battling, people who are sick battling, going to Congress, pushing. And it's like, sometimes there are stories of hope, right? Like recently, somebody's nomination for a certain district level for the EPA was rescinded because two of the senators really are battling PFAS in their states and are listening to their communities. So, there's a lot of examples of people speaking up, but a lot of pain. So if you start from Love Canal, one of the oldest environmental disasters, if you think about the movie Erin Brockovich, which is around chromium, if you think about I'm blanking on the name, John Travolta acted in the movie version of the book. It's about chemicals in groundwater, for example. Again, advocacy, people really speaking up, going to law, lawyers working pro bono. So there's, I can send you some books and articles offline, but there's a lot of cases that has victories there. And, again, yes, the people of Mavallipura aren't quite there yet, but that is another victory here in Bangalore. And there's lots more in that story, but I think, again, people speaking up and things moving forward. Yeah. Thank you.